In First, we meet the woman who shattered one of the highest glass ceilings in the land. President Ronald Reagan made history when he announced her nomination on July 7, 1981.
I will send to the Senate the nomination of Judge Sandra Day O'Connor of Arizona Court of Appeals for confirmation as an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
It was a stunning advancement for our nation, and one of the first things we learn in First is that Sandra Day O'Connor was uniquely qualified to carry it forward.
She knew what it was like to be an outsider. That informed her judgment.
As a child growing up on a remote, sprawling ranch in the Arizona desert, she developed an inner toughness that helped her push through challenges that could have stopped her. From leaving home at a young age to attend school, to facing the reality of discrimination later on.
When she's coming out of law school, high in her class, not a single law firm in the state of California will even give her an interview as a lawyer. One gave her an interview to be a legal secretary and asked her how her typing was.
Thomas, a former reporter and editor at Time and Newsweek and the author of 10 books, was given unprecedented access to O'Connor's personal papers and former law clerks. The result is a complex and fascinating portrait of the person beneath the robe.
I spent hours and hours and hours with the clerks and with my wife and with 7 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court and various federal judges trying to figure her out, because it's not always quite so clear. I think we got there, but I've never worked so hard in my life.
As readers and Americans, we're fortunate he did. About 6 months before the release of First, O'Connor announced that she would retire from public life due to advancing dementia, leaving behind a legacy of civility that's been hard to replace.
Working on this book made me conscious of something that we have lost in our public life, and I'd like to get it back.
Find out why that matters in this edition of First Person, one-on-one with Evan Thomas, presented by St. Louis County Library and HEC Media. Evan Thomas, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Brenda.
This is your 10th book, but the title is First. And as I read it, I kept coming back to what a great title that really is, because that is really the essence of what you're exploring here, is the burden and the blessing of being first.
Both. I mean, she came into a man's man, the law especially, is it was a man's world. I mean, these incredible stories of when she's coming out of law school, high in her class. They didn't keep class rank at Stanford, but maybe number 3. Not a single law firm in the state of California will even give her an interview as a lawyer. One gave her an interview to be a legal secretary and asked her how her typing was. That's, you know, it was just a dark age compared to today. Not that we don't have ways to go today, but compared to today, it was just the dark ages. So she was not only the first Supreme Court justice, female Supreme, but first majority leader of a state senate in Arizona, of any state, but she was in Arizona.
And even first in her family to leave the ranch and to go do so many things on her own at such a young age. She was really always by herself in a way. Even though she had a great family support, she was a trailblazer. Right, she had to be brave at a very young age.
And although she was enormously confident and comes across that way, she was scared. You know, it was interesting to me, public speaking, for instance. She's given more speeches than any Supreme Court justice in history. She's been to all 50 states. She's been all over the world preaching the rule of law. But when she was young, she was afraid of public speaking. Her law school pal, Beatsy Laws, was really worried about her performance at the moot court, you know, these competitions in law school, because she was scared of talking. And she herself said that when she was a lawyer, you know, her knees would knock and her throat would close. She had to overcome a lot of fear, but she did.
And you get the sense that it wasn't that she was fearless, but she pushed ahead.
Yes, I mean, it was all about overcoming fear. Courage is not being afraid, it's being afraid and overcoming it.
What drew you to this project? How did it all start for you?
Justice O'Connor had been thinking about doing her memoir. She wrote a memoir about her life on the ranch called The Lazy Bee, but just to do a full memoir. But she never got around to it. I have a feeling she wanted to be remembered, but I don't think she really wanted to spill all the beans. So it's got stalled. So anyway, she got Alzheimer's herself. She got dementia.
In the process
in
of
the
this.
process while she was thinking about this. And so the family decided, and she decided, let's just go with a biography. I was the Random House author with a law degree.
Oh, okay.
And so they came to me. They checked me out with some other historians, and so they came to me.
Oh, they came to you. Okay. I wondered if it was something that had just been a project for you too.
Well, I jumped at it. I said yes. It's not an authorized book. They have no control over it, but I did have complete access. The Supreme Court is a secret place. You can't do a really good one unless you're inside. And I had a letter from her to all of her law clerks, to the other justices, to her friends, asking them to talk to me. And I was given exclusive access to her papers.
Were you worried about that when you took on the project initially? Or obviously they assured you that you would have that kind of access, I guess, at some point during it. But
I was worried about everything. I mean, this is a tall mountain to climb. And sure, I was worried about how forthcoming the clerks would be. They know every justice has 4 law clerks every year. So there are 108 of them if you count some at the end. And my wife and I talked to 94 of them. And it varies. I mean, some were very forthcoming and others were less so, but that's how you find out.
Huge level of responsibility taking on this story. What was your reaction when you realized that they were going to ask you to do this?
Fear. But I spent 3 years on it. And, and this is not my first rodeo. I've written 10 books. So I've been here before. And the trick is to just bite off little pieces day after day. And then you learn the subject, you become immersed in it, and it becomes fun. About halfway through it, it becomes fun.
What did your wife say when you were?
Well, she was intrigued to do it because we met in law school. We met in constitutional law class, or civil procedure class actually, at UVA Law School a long time ago. She became a lawyer. She practiced for 25 years. I never practiced law. So she was happy to get involved in this. And she actually read the cases more closely than I did and is a much better lawyer than I am, so she was immensely helpful.
Was it a thrill for her at this point in her career too, and professional life, to get to crack at this?
Yeah, well, we're 67. In fact, she just turned 68 today. Yeah, I mean, it's a thrilling thing. Just spending the time at the Supreme Court. Talk about cool buildings. To spend time in their chambers. We had a parking place we would come to, and we spent a lot of time in their chambers and interviewing. I mean, we interviewed 7 justices, and it's just thrilling.
One thing that's very clear too in her early life and then in her years in law school is she always knew her own mind. I mean, she certainly had many options and directions she could have gone in, but she wasn't overly influenced by other people. And that was true too in her choice of partner in John O'Connor.
Although I just finished saying that she was scared at times, she had a deep inner gyroscope, confidence, whatever you call it.
Yeah, kind of a compass.
Even a sense of destiny. She once wrote a note about her own sense of destiny. She had this, some people are just born with it. Not just born with it. Her father, although he's a harsh guy and rude in some ways, loved her and supported her and adored her, and she bathed in that. And her mother loved her and supported her, and she felt their love. And I think that was enormously affirming to her.
You've talked a little bit too in these last few days in different interviews about what she gained from her mother, and there were some really important things that she learned about just human behavior and interaction and succeeding on your own terms.
This was to me really important. The father, wonderful though he was, after a couple of drinks could be a bully at night. And Sandra's there and watching this, and the father was a provocateur. Sandra watched as her mother, who's a lovely person on this dusty ranch, her mother always wore a dress, hose, nice shoes, wanting to be a lady, not wanting to learn to milk the cow, always a lady. But importantly, the mother, when the father starts going after the mom, she does not take the bait. She's not putting him down, she's not fleeing and crying, she's just rolling with it. That was an incredibly important lesson.
Very secure. Very
secure, but just learning how to deal with difficult males. When Sandra is the majority leader of the state Senate in the Arizona Senate in 1970, the males are terrible to her. Some of them are drunk, they're teasing her, they're giving her a hard time. She walks away from the stupid fights. Let the other person overreact. Now, it was hard on her. One of her aides told me she found her once crying in the bathroom. She's not invulnerable, but she would either just tough it out or just roll with it.
What drove her to continue on through that? There were many who would say, I don't need this. She never backed down.
I think at some point she realizes she's a role model for women.
She always had that sense?
Yeah, I mean, she's not a feminist in our modern sense. She didn't even use the word feminist.
But that sense that I know I can withstand it, so I have an obligation to continue on.
She wanted to be a bridge from the kind of traditional woman to something else.
You describe her as the most powerful woman in America of her time, really.
Well, as compared to, yes. I mean, she had a lot, leaving aside comparisons, she was the Supreme Court Justice who preserved abortion rights and affirmative action for 25 years. I don't care what gender you are, that's a pretty big legacy.
One of the things you pointed out is that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has been getting a lot of attention, deservedly so, of course, for her accomplishments too, but that we often forget that she is the dissenting.
Yeah.
And Sandra Day O'Connor was a...
330 times in 25 years, Sandra Day O'Connor cast the decisive vote. That's a lot of power. And as you say, Justice Ginsburg really did her most influential work as a lawyer. If you see the movie, it's the I mean, she's been a good justice, but she's been in the minority a lot. Justice O'Connor liked to be in the majority, and she understood political power. I have to say, political is a dangerous word to use with the Supreme Court. I mean, a sort of small p political, but she knew how to get 5 votes.
Looking back on even the beginning of her law career, was being a judge something that was always an aspiration of hers, or was it something that she came to more out of the way things went, but yet found a real, true affinity for it and a very deep?
Yeah, that's a really good question that I don't actually know the answer to. She decides to become a judge when she's in the state legislature. And part of it is just wanting to get out of the state legislature. Did she have some deep yearning from way back to be a judge? I don't think so. I have asked this question. I really couldn't ask it meaningfully of her because she had dementia by the time I really started talking to her about this. I have asked this question of her sons. Their version is that she wanted to be a good lawyer, but the judge part came later. But who knows? She may have as a little, who knows who knows what we imagine when we're children. We have dreams.
You go back a lot to her love of that course she took in Western civilization and how it colored and influenced her intellect as a judge and her decision making as a judge. It was very important to her to be fair.
I think what you're driving at is she was very non-ideological.
Right.
She was very pragmatic and very balanced. And she didn't really like elaborate jurisprudential theories. She jokingly said to me,
she didn't have an agenda beyond.
No, she did not. I mean, she really wanted to play it straight. Now, this is a difficult subject because even judges who say they are playing it straight are influenced by there's a whole school of legal realism which suggests that all judges are influenced by the hamburger they ate for lunch. I mean, there's no such thing as a truly neutral judge. So, and I think there's some truth to that. But she made a super effort to be neutral, to call them as she saw them, listen to the facts, be practical, look at the practical consequences, as opposed to having a certain ideology that drove all her decisions.
And skills she learned in the legislature too.
Yeah. Political skills she learned in the legislature.
What was it like for you too, as you said, having a law degree but not having pursued that long-term as your career, but what was it like to see her development as a justice, as a judge, and the way she grew into that role, which is, again, not always something we get access to?
Hard.
Yeah, a lot of reading.
I needed a lot of help. She had these law clerks. I interviewed a lot of them. They were my guides. They're the kind of Sherpas through the mountain passes. One I can think of in particularly, a UCLA professor named Dan Bussell, who really helped me see clearly. I spent hours and hours and hours with the clerks and with my wife and with 7 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court and various federal judges trying to figure her out, because it's not always quite so clear. I think we got there, but I've never worked so hard in my life.
What surprised you about the process of this book as compared to your others? As you said, very dense subject matter, but Was this the first female that you've ever done a biography on?
I mean,
okay.
let's start there.
that
That's
had
one
to
reason why
be.
my wife was so deeply involved, was because my wife, who went to Stanford from the West, was a lawyer, real lawyer. I'm not a real lawyer.
Play one on TV.
I went to law school. I have a law degree. But my wife really understood it better than I did. And so it was a challenge.
When you get to that moment or that part in the biography where you talk about she's on the list, they're coming down to interview her, the wheels are starting to roll, and it's funny because as a reader, I found myself thinking too, well, like, do you even want this? Like, what, if you're a mother with kids, you think, do you even want to take this on? And it struck me as no one would ever have said that about a male judge. It would be, of course, who turns that down?
Yeah, well, her husband understood that, because there was a moment when she said, and he said,
naturally.
and he said, no.
Yeah, it was interesting to me the first time in history that had to be a question of, do you want this? Because there's not a male judge out there who would
she had
question
a
that.
pretty good life, and was a mom with 3 sons, and was a big power in the state. And why do this in terms of lifestyle, for sure, and also knowing that it would stress her marriage.
Right, and that it would dramatically change
Everything.
Right.
Well, she said this changes everything, and of course it did.
And yet, even though it's not necessarily all in her words, and as you're sort of taking us through the play-by-play of that, you do get this sense of, but she realized, I'm in the position to do this, and I have to, because it's bigger than me.
She sort of couldn't believe it. I mean, one thing that was interesting was I have her husband's diary, and so when the Justice Department lawyers came down to interview her, it was clear to him that she had the job. And he's in the diary, you got the job. And she agrees. But a couple of days later, after she's actually met with the President Reagan, she sort of can't believe it. It's just like, this can't be real.
Get her head around it. Yeah, that's true. You talk a lot about, too, of the adjustment to the culture of the Supreme Court, and that it is this very different animal than any other branch of government.
I'll say. I mean, I've covered Congress and I've covered presidents. I was a Washington bureau chief at Newsweek for 10 years, so I've been there. But this is a whole different world. Justices can talk to nobody. They don't even talk to each other. They talk by memo at each other, and it's very cerebral. Now, that's not to say it isn't political, but it's very cerebral. And if you just read the memos they exchange, they're highly technical, and it's an incredible level of intellectual rigor. Now, some of their decisions, the experts would say, are perhaps less than rigorous, but compared to Congress or the White House, it's a different branch of government.
And the level of responsibility and weight that they feel, I'm sure.
They do. I mean, one thing I learned is that she was good on this. The Supreme Court, we think of the Supreme Court as the last word. It's actually not. It's her view of it was that it's part of this conversation with the other branches of government. She had no hesitation to send a case back for more facts or to take a second look. She understood, and maybe from that Western Civ course, but she really understood the 3 branches of government and how they need to talk to each other, and they need to be checks on each other. And it's a mistake if any one of them gets too powerful.
You've mentioned, too, that she was very pragmatic about this has to be able to live in the real world. This has to apply to how our country is today and what's needed, and that she approached things from that viewpoint of...
I mean, people get grumpy about the Supreme Court, they're not supposed to look at the polls. I don't think she looked at the polls, but she could tell you, for instance, that a third of the country is completely against abortion under any circumstances, a third of the country is for abortion under any circumstances, and a third is somewhere in between. I'm sure she didn't have to read a Gallup poll to know that. Did that influence her? Yes.
Coming from that background of, I hate to use the word outlier, but of not being where we see so many justices come from now, from this pipeline of certain schools and backgrounds, et cetera. I mean, she was, again, I'm not fond of the word outlier, but in that way, how much did that inform her viewpoint and how she regarded cases?
And two ways. One, being a woman also is an outsider. I mean, for instance, in freedom of religion. In the 60s, the Supreme Court basically said to religion, get out of the public place. In the 70s and 80s, the conservatives were trying to bring it back a little bit, prayer in schools, or a moment of silence. And they expected her to come on board for that. She didn't, because her test was, does it make you feel like an outsider? If there's a cross in front of the courthouse, or a crush scene. The issue for her is, does it make the average person feel like an outsider? She knew what it was like to be an outsider. That informed her judgment.
In the beginning, you can see her struggling to get a hold of this way things work there and the culture. At what point did she start to sort of hit her stride and really somewhat revel in just the enjoying of what she was doing, or
Well, it was hard at first. I mean, she goes to her first conference. They have this nice tradition in the court of the justices all shaking hands. Justice Byron White, Whizzer White, who had been an all-pro halfback, crushes her hand. She goes into her first conference with tears, as she put it, squirting out of her eyes. And she knows that she's behind the intellectual 8-ball with these guys because she just doesn't know as much. But she was a fast study. And within a couple of weeks, Justice Powell is writing his family. She's brilliant. So I think fairly quickly she got it. She told her husband after a year, she felt, I'm okay.
You, as you mentioned, had unprecedented access to her law clerks. You do get a sense of affection from them when they're talking to her. They're not sugarcoating any aspects of her personality, but they're very forthcoming and gives you the sense of a true respect for her and
well, they were scared
gratitude for.
Initially, they're scared of her. Your average Supreme Court law clerk has been praised by adults repeatedly because they're the editor of the Yale Law Journal or whatever. Yeah, so they're used to that. They get to her chambers, ain't no praise on the ranch, no gratuitous praise on the ranch. She might say, well, that's okay. And so, and she can be a little frosty and intimidating. And so initially, many of them were frightened of her. One of them said, I spent a lot of time crying down by the vending machines. But they learned that she cared about them. She cared about their lives. She cared about their children and she wanted to pick husbands for them. She was a little directive. She deeply cared about them. And so not all of them, I mean, some of them don't like her, but almost all of them have a real sense of attachment to her.
She's very tough, but she has empathy.
Yeah. Where does that come from? I mean, lots of different places. But yeah, she had deep empathy, and it affected her jurisprudence, although she's conservative. When cases involve children, you can feel it. She moves to the left and starts doing things that she might not otherwise do because she's worried about the impact of, there's a famous case where a soccer mom got pulled over by the cops and she didn't have a license and they marched her off to jail. And the conservatives said, well, that may be harsh, but there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't go to jail for a misdemeanor. She said, no, that's wrong. For one thing, she understood how the cops could use that for racial profiling. And so she had a sensitivity that other justices did not have.
She came in as a pioneer with so many other young women law students at that time too, and they faced so many barriers, and yet the dam sort of opened up in the 20 years after that. How much, of course, of a role did she have to play in that even before getting to the Supreme Court? Because she wasn't someone then that said, all right, you're not going to hire me, I'm going to go home.
No, she was not.
She found a way around it.
Yeah, she doesn't fit in that easily with modern campus Me Too feminism. That's not her deal. She wanted to be effective, and she wouldn't have been effective if she had been that way. That's not to say she wasn't fierce and tough and brave and effective. I mean, one example is the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. She introduces it into the Arizona Senate and then lets it die in committee. The feminists are furious at her for betraying them. Why did she do that? Because she knew that it did not have the votes to pass on the floor. So why get into a virtuous, righteous fight that she's going to lose? Instead, as majority leader, she methodically changes every law that discriminates against women in the state of Arizona, dozens of laws. So she has a huge, instead of fighting a heroic fight that might make you feel good and you can go on cable TV and boast about it, she quietly behind the scenes gets the job done. This is classic O'Connor. And of course, the activists were mad at her. Oh, you're selling out and you're just doing this to get a federal judgeship. But I interviewed them, they're still mad at her. But, in terms of actual impact and results.
Right. And through the course of reading this too, you realize that you needed everybody in that party in the area that they were in, right? You needed the activists, but you needed someone like her too who
Well, this is very
was pragmatic
unfashionable
about it.
today, but she believed in moderation, compromise, bridge building, all the stuff that they don't do today in legislatures.
And among the justices too, she took special care to build the relationships she could build with them.
She made them go to lunch. Really basic thing. When she first got there, only half the justices went to lunch. They didn't like each other. That book had just come out called The Brethren, which was full of gossip, and they were suspicious of each other, who leaked it, you know. And she said, no, we're going to all have lunch together. And it took a long time, but she got them all to come to lunch. I love the story of Clarence Thomas, who, you know, the Anita Hill hearings were really rough, and he's all beat up by that. And she doesn't love those hearings, but she says, you know, Clarence, you got to come to lunch. And he doesn't want to, but she says, Clarence, you have to come to lunch. And he does, and he told me that made all the difference. Because they don't have to like each other, but they do have to have lunch together. They have to work together.
Use the word civility a lot.
Civility. She was a big believer in civility, kind of a quaint, archaic word today, but the essence of what she believed in.
You talk a lot, too, just about the legacy and that she was aware of who she was. It was bigger than her. It wasn't an ego thing, but she understood her place in this pivotal decision.
Yeah, she saw herself as a bridge. She had a poem, a hokey poem that she carried around about the bridge builder. Somebody who builds a bridge, but then doesn't cross it, lets other pilgrims go across. She was confirmed 99-0.
Would that at all have happened now?
Not a chance. Not a chance. I mean, for one thing, she wouldn't have even, they would have found out that she wasn't right on abortion, and they would have, you know, it just, I mean, you can tell from the way I'm speaking that I think something is wrong now. I don't, you know, I need to be careful not to impose my own views on today. But working on this book made me conscious of something that we have lost in our public life, and I'd like to get it back.
Throughout this project, and as you finished it and wrapped it up and now you're presenting it to the public, what do you want readers to walk away knowing about her or truly understanding about Sandra Day O'Connor?
Her courage to do what she did took enormous courage. It's a very human story. She was human, you know, she cried, but she had great courage. And although she was this remote figure in a robe, and actually sort of a forgotten figure because Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, and you know, Ruth Bader Ginsburg should be honored, but there was somebody 12 years before Ginsburg who was an immensely important figure and was intensely human and a great American story that we should be proud of.
You've mentioned too, right, the female justices all readily give her due for that.
They sure do. I mean, you know, they know she opened the door.
Evan Thomas, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for having me.